Have you learned anything new, Ryo?
Not about your father, no.
I see.
Shenmue. Ah, Shenmue. I remember those heady days in the year 2000. We were so young then. We shared some laughs. We had some fallings out, but we stuck by each other. Until you left, I thought, never to return. And then, after so many years away, you teased a return, if I could only help you out with a fare to get here. So I did what old friends do when they need some financial support. I reached for my wallet. Yes, that's right. I was one of Shenmue 3's Kickstarter backers. As an avid fan of the Dreamcast, Sega's bittersweet final entry in the console business, I can remember purchasing the original Shenmue on the day of its release. This is an important point because it means I've waited as long as any gamer has ever waited to see the next chapter in a game story unfold. I don't think there's ever been another game series that has spent so long in hiatus before getting the chance to continue with its narrative. Gordon Freeman has a few years to go yet. Of course I was eager to see Ryo's tale continue after such a long wait, and I was happy to contribute 30 quid to see that possibility become a reality. Shenmue fans like myself have literally waited an entire generation to see this story continue, and I'm not talking about a console generation either. And now that game that I never thought I'd see is actually out, and I have played it to completion. So what's the verdict? As an OG fan of the series, was it everything I hoped it would be? It's complicated. There are certainly things about the game that I like, and just the fact that it got made at all is remarkable. But even with as much goodwill as I can muster, it has some problems. Oh, it has some problems. Let's start with the characters. Shenmue 3 begins just as Shenmue 2 ended, in a mysterious cave in rural China. To a longtime fan like myself, this is a compelling moment. Warm feelings of nostalgia flood my mind, not just for Shenmue, but for the simpler pleasures of a bygone age of gaming, when the act of being able to open every drawer in a house was a mind-blowing feat of technical wizardry. It doesn't take long, however, for those feelings to start waning, as the flat, dreary dialogue and unnatural delivery start to suck the energy out of the experience. With the best will in the world, Yu Suzuki has a tin ear for dialogue. Conversations somehow manage to sound both completely ordinary and trivial, but also weirdly hokey at the same time. The two main characters of Ryo and Shenhua frequently interact in the most banal way imaginable. Check out this fascinating exchange, for example.
Good morning, Ryo.
Good morning.
Did you get enough rest?
Yeah.
And this happens every single sodding day. Yet even conversations as prosaic as this manage to sound peculiar because the vocal performances don't really convey the impression of an actual conversation taking place. The actors just sound like they're reading lines off a page in separate rooms, probably because they were. It doesn't help that the pauses between one character finishing speaking and the next character starting speaking are often a bit too long.
That's just how things work here.
Now, I'm inclined to give the voice actors the benefit of the doubt here and say that this is likely due to poor direction and uninspired characterization by the game's leadership than the actor's ability to deliver lines. I mean, without adequate direction, even Sir Patrick Stewart would find it difficult to make this dialogue sound compelling.
Of course. Our doors are open to everyone that comes here looking to master the martial arts.
This issue is further compounded by the fact that the back and forth characters have with each other doesn't always match up properly. One character will finish speaking and the next character's response can sometimes be a little off.
Is that so?
A response may sound like a query when it should just be an acknowledgement.
I'm going to go back to the room.
Okay.
Or dialogue may start with a really strange opening.
What the...
This creates an impression that some of the interactions were cobbled together from bits of recordings that were not originally intended for that purpose. Of course, I don't know if that's actually the case, but I sure hope it is, because I'd hate to believe that conversations sounding this stilted were due to a deliberate creative choice. And then there is Rio. Oh boy. He's never been the most charismatic of protagonists.
What do you mean by that?
But even by his own standards, he seems to have regressed a bit. In Shenmue 3, he constantly sounds unsure and hesitant, as if the most basic form of small talk is baffling to him.
Sure.
Even in the first game, he had a few moments of self-assurance.
And just who are you? Don't you know that blackmail is way uncool?
But here, he's so insipid at times that playing as him just gets irritating. As in, I can't be bothered to continue playing at the moment because you're so rubbish kind of irritating. The visual aesthetic of Shenmue 3 is certainly faithful to the first two games. What I mean by this is that a lot of the work appears to have gone into the game's environment, while the human figures are not always as convincing. When it comes to the way characters look, the game's art style is slightly muddled in that some figures appear like realistic representations of actual people, while at other times characters look more like anime figures, with exaggerated features intended to emphasize their equally cartoonish personalities. The visual quality is fine enough.
Not great, not terrible.
But looking at this game, you would not think that 20 years had passed since the first entry in the series. For comparison, the original Resident Evil 2 looked like this, and its remake looks like this. Over a similar period of time, Shenmue has gone from this to this. Now I know I'm not being entirely fair here. Although Capcom doesn't appear to have released the budget for the Resident Evil 2 remake, more than 800 development staff apparently worked on it, so the budget will have undoubtedly been many times the $7 million raised for Shenmue 3. Nonetheless, Shenmue 3 looks like it could have been released 15 years ago on the PS3. It uses Unreal Engine 4, but probably could have been made using Unreal Engine 2. BioShock, for example, was made using a modified version of Unreal Engine 2, and it looks the equal of Shenmue 3, even though a dozen years separate the two games. Wow, there's a lot of numbers in that sentence. That's not to say that the visuals in Shenmue 3 are janky, however. There is some great environmental work here, particularly when the story shifts to the city of Nyawu in the game's second half, with its gloriously coloured shrines and temples. It's just a shame that a game series that was legendary for pushing technical boundaries has delivered a third installment that comes nowhere close to utilising the power of its game engine to anything like its full potential. This isn't a question of budget either, when you consider that Ninja Theory, armed with the same Unreal Engine 4 and with a similarly sized development team and budget, were able to deliver Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, featuring an almost photorealistic main character with astonishingly lifelike expressiveness. Now, Ninja Theory used a full performance capture system in the making of Hellblade. However, even without this, facial animation has come on leaps and bounds in the last 20 years. Hell, even Half-Life 2's characters still hold up today as an example of how to do facial expressiveness in games. Shenmue 3 goes to great lengths to capture some aspects of real life, even going so far as to include an animation of Ryo taking off his shoes when he goes into the living room. Unfortunately, there's too much focus on trivialities like this, and not enough on conveying emotion. If the way that characters interact with each other seems flat and unrealistic, it's very hard for us to feel any empathy for them. In this regard, Shenmue 3 feels embarrassingly out of time. Ryo remains as blank and inexpressive as he ever was. A lack of emotional investment is kryptonite for the narrative experience, but that's not necessarily a deal breaker because the overall package could still be redeemed with strong gameplay. If your game has average gameplay, it had better have a compelling story. If the story is lacking, you'd better have enjoyable gameplay. But if both are below par, then you've got real problems. Unfortunately, Shenmue 3 falls into the latter category. If the previous issues I've mentioned were just me pulling at loose threads, then this is where the fabric of Shenmue 3 really starts to unravel. At its most basic level, the gameplay consists of two aspects: improving your fighting ability for the inevitable confrontations you'll face, and searching the environment for clues in order to advance the story. Both elements are very faithful to the first two games, and to be fair, they do feature some welcome new improvements. The biggest problem is that both the story exploration element and the fighting system really needed a complete overhaul and not just extra tinkering, but I'll get to that in a bit. Let's look at the positives first. The fighting system will be familiar to anyone who has played the first two games, in that you start with a small number of moves and then learn more by acquiring scrolls, either by buying them in martial arts stores, collecting sets of objects and then exchanging them for scrolls, or completing optional events. Practicing your moves in training sessions levels them up, which makes them more effective and also increases your overall attack power. Moves are performed through combinations of button presses, like an old school one-on-one fighting game like Street Fighter. This is a throwback to Shenmue's roots in Virtua Fighter, Sega's fighting game series which was developed by Yu Suzuki back in the day. More powerful moves require more complex combinations, however a welcome new feature is the skillbook editor, which enables you to assign several moves to the right trigger. In training sessions, you still need to pull off the button combination, but you do get a visual prompt. But in actual fights, the skillbook editor allows you to use your most powerful moves with a simple squeeze of the trigger. You can also cycle through your assigned moves while in combat. You can choose up to 5 of them, so that you're not just using the same move over and over again. This is good stuff. Another enhancement is that training now involves sparring with an opponent, which makes leveling up your moves much more enjoyable than before. In previous Shenmue games, you practiced the moves on your own, and throwing punches at thin air very quickly became tiresome. Sparring is also helpful for practicing dodging, which is perhaps the most important aspect of the fighting system to learn. This is because enemies block a lot. More often than not, in fact. Sometimes the only way to land an effective hit is to wait for them to attack first and then dodge to the side when they do. This opens them up to a strong counterattack, and you can usually knock them down if your chosen move is leveled up high enough. An issue with this fighting system is that there are a very large number of movement scrolls to be had, but a lot of the moves are very similar and not all of them are useful. There are some that you might expect to be effective, but in fact the animation takes too long, so that even when leveled up to their maximum, they will continue to bounce harmlessly off your opponent's block. But even the most frustrating aspects of the fighting system pale in comparison to the deadening mediocrity of improving your health points. Sparring will increase your attack power, but improving your health means working on your endurance level, and this is only done through maddeningly repetitive minigames involving wooden dummies. You find yourself constantly performing the same boring, challengeless actions over and over again just to add a few extra health points. This is Shenmue at its absolute worst and could have easily been improved by enabling you to increase health through fighting. Perhaps by making fights against multiple opponents something that increases your endurance, for example. Honestly, it does not take too much horse stance to make you start questioning your life choices. Even more maddeningly, your health now declines all the time, all throughout the day, forcing you to constantly eat stuff so you can continue to run around without having to stop every few seconds. This is such an odd mechanic, I just can't get my head around it. It wasn't in the first two games and it adds nothing to the gameplay. It's just a completely unnecessary hindrance is what it is, with replenishing your food supply a small but relentless drain on your finances. In the first half of the game, the most effective food stuff is black garlic, which conjures up an odd mental image of Ryo running around bothering the village folk with his cheeks stuffed full of raw garlic cloves. No wonder the townspeople don't respond well to him.
Hey.
Oh, it's you again.
But this still isn't the biggest problem with the game. The single biggest issue, for me at least, is how you progress through the story. Now, I haven't played every single open world game of the last 20 years, but I have played quite a few of them. And in all of those games, there's a common approach taken. There will be a main quest somewhere that advances the main story, and other optional side quests that are not essential but will reward you in some way or reveal more about the world or the characters or something. This approach allows the player to play the game at the pace they prefer, rattling through the main narrative for example, or just getting lost in the world. Shenmue 3 does not adopt this approach however, instead it rigidly sticks to its own 20-year-old formula, which in all honesty was not that great to begin with.
Huh.
Instead of having a clearly marked main quest you can go to whenever you want to advance the story, in Shenmue 3 you are given a vague objective and you then have to discover on your own what Ryo actually needs to do, usually through sheer trial and error. Often this means just wandering around the area asking the same question to every person there is in order to just find the one person who can give you the next piece of useful information.
Do you know this person? Have you seen this person? Have you seen this person? Do you know this person?
As you can imagine, this gets tiresome very quickly. Assuming that you don't turn to a game guide for help, which you undoubtedly will at some point, because there's only so many times you can listen to Ryo ask the same question over and over again, like one of those charity marketeers that try to stop you in the street when you're just passing by, try to get your lunch. Look, can I do that without being made to feel guilty? I'm sorry the children are suffering, I really am, but I've got to go, I really do, I'm sorry. For me, this is Shenmue 3's biggest missed opportunity. This is the one thing above all others that really needed reformation. Just take a leaf out of Yakuza's book, why don't you? The Yakuza series was, after all, the spiritual successor to Shenmue, taking its template and building on it in order to create something glorious. And bonkers. Shenmue 3 could have returned the favour, but instead it sticks to the same formula it created in 1999. It's a huge mistake, because so much time is spent just piecing together what your next objective is and then how to get to it that not much time is actually given over to, doing the quest itself. This kills the pace of the game and severely limits narrative development. Instead of crafting fun, unique quests that would provide an opportunity to develop the characters or their story in new ways, the developers seem to have instead spent much of their time making sure that every NPC in the game has the ability to say, "Sorry, I can't help you."
No, that I recall.
He's never been here.
I don't remember.
This is a 40-hour game, but in terms of its story, it could easily be told in less than half that time, maybe even a third. There's one revelation at the game's midpoint, but not that much before it, and not that much after it until the last couple of hours. The last thing I want to touch upon in this review is the narrative itself, how it is told and where it ends up. Obviously, this will be going into spoiler territory, so please continue only if you've either played the game to completion or you simply don't care. Some Shenmue fans will undoubtedly argue that they like the slower, gentler pace of the game, that the game was never meant to be a propulsive action-adventure, and therefore how dare anyone suggest that it should become more like Yakuza. There are times when Shenmue 3 can be charming, but there's one moment that I think illustrates how even when it is being charming, Shenmue stumbles. It occurs not long after you arrive in Niawu. You retire to your hotel room and notice that your companion Shenhua is outside on the balcony. You go outside and you hear her singing a mournful song.
きらめくサンレイ湧き出す冷たい水は白露まとった清らな森にしみる
This is a really good setup for developing an emotional connection between the two characters and adding a bit of depth to their relationship. Shenhua has never been in a big city before, never even left the village she grew up in. And now she's here searching for her father who has been taken from her, with a friend that she hasn't really known for very long. You can imagine that she's probably feeling overwhelmed and confused, and is singing to try and regain some composure and feel at ease, even if the feeling itself is fleeting. But before we get the chance to explore this, the scene abruptly ends. Shenhua almost speaks, but Ryo promptly shuts her down with, "I'm sure it's fine, everything's fine, don't worry your pretty little head." It's a real shame that more wasn't done with this. Perhaps Ryo could have stood in the doorway for a moment just listening to her sing, not wanting to interrupt. Maybe Shenhua gets lost in the moment and doesn't notice him, but then becomes self-conscious and embarrassed when he starts to applaud her. Perhaps he apologizes for making her feel awkward, and then she opens up to him about how difficult she's finding it being away from everything that she knows. Maybe then he takes her hand and they get closer, but then they are interrupted by another guest coming out onto the balcony, so they stop and retire to their rooms. It doesn't take a great deal of thought to give the characters a little extra development. I came up with that in about the same amount of time it took to write it down. Even if, it was a little cliche, something is better than nothing. Now just compare that moment to this one from The Witcher 3, where Geralt and friends listen to a song by Priscilla, the girlfriend of Geralt's best friend Dandelion. This is the first time we see her in the game. Anticipation for her performance is built by first showing her tune her instrument, and the crowd turns to watch. The song plays out in full, and throughout, charming little moments are thrown in, like the patrolling guard outside who stops to watch, and audience members becoming emotional. The sequence is even better when you realise that the song lyrics are about Geralt and Yennefer's magically intertwined fates, and then their separation.
Hardening into stone, amidst the cold to hold you in a heated embrace, you flee. My dream come the morning, your scent, berries tart, lilac sweet, to dream of raven locks and twisted stormy, of violet
I'm not crying,
eyes
you're crying.
glistening as you weep.
It's scenes like this that really help get players invested in the characters and their story, by letting us see them as something other than just the avatars of our own actions. This is why I think Yu Suzuki, for all of his legendary talents as a game developer, is just not suited for writing long-form narrative. The way the game ends is another example. You finally reach the castle on the hill, where Lan Di, the main villain, awaits. This is the first time in the entire series that you get to go toe-to-toe with your father's killer. Shenmue fans have literally waited 20 years to confront this guy. Imagine the multitude of ways this could play out. So what do they end up going with? He blocks everything. You don't get to land a single hit, and then he gets bored and kicks your arse. Ugh! Was this what we really waited 2 decades for? Seriously? The ending provides no resolution at all, and instead proffers a hope that the story will continue on with Shenmue 4. Ending with another cliffhanger is either the ballsiest move in gaming history or an act of wishful thinking that borders on delusional. This franchise was dead in the water until Kickstarter offered a new way of funding game development. raising $7 million, the highest total for a video game project ever accumulated on Kickstarter, was capturing lightning in a bottle. Could Suzuki really do it again? It's possible, but the possibility seems more and more doubtful in light of how Shenmue 3 has turned out and the limited appeal it has beyond the fan base. Then there's also the controversy surrounding the exclusivity deal with Epic and the resulting change of platform from Steam for the PC release that may leave a bad taste in the mouth of some fans. Fool me once, as they say.
Shame on you. You fool me, we can't get fooled again.
You said it, George. Yu Suzuki and his team could instead turn to the publishers for funding, but it's possible they may balk at providing even the relatively paltry sum raised for Shenmue 3 when it clearly doesn't have mass market appeal. If this is indeed then the end of Shenmue, it's a shame that it has never quite managed to live up to the ambitions of its creator. If at some point in the future Shenmue 4 did appear to be on the cards, Suzuki may well have to let go of the reins and entrust the conclusion of his epic to others that possess a greater understanding of how to write a story-rich open-world game to the standard that players expect these days. And after playing Shenmue 3, I don't think that would be such a bad thing.
Until next time!